booked all 6 people for it. I just kept
There we go.
looking people and looking people. My
Uh,
stepfather.
Yep. And you are good to go,
My
so just
sister-in-law's
keep
here
your
now.
eye on the
Yeah.
admissions, and thanks so much.
Calvi. My sister-in-law, my brother.
Yeah.
was in Guelph. West.
My daughter and my 2 daughters live in Michigan,
Okay.
right near Alberta. Yeah.
I think we're going to get started. ladies.
Okay.
We have, I think we're all online here. Can everybody hear us okay? We're going to be doing simultaneous Zoom, as well as we have some attendees here as well too in person today.
Hello, sorry.
Hello. Have a seat. Great.
Noise.
Yes. Well, I'll take notes from them.
Okay. Well, and everyone's wondering whether to take notes or not. And so I have a lot of content to share today, and I do want to make sure that everyone gets as much as they want in terms of information after. So I'll go ahead, and if you leave me your email address, and as well to the people online, if you'd like to forward your email address to either Barb or myself, at info@healthspan.ca, then I'll make sure that everyone has a PDF of the slides themselves, so that you don't necessarily have to feel like you have to be writing frantically through this. Okay, good. So anyway, good. Thank you for attending today. I'm excited to do this. My name is Julia Fountain. I'm a naturopathic doctor here in town, and Healthspan Wellness is my clinic. We've been here since 2006. I am a naturopathic doctor, but I'm also a NAM certified menopause practitioner, which is really a very specific level of training to be able to work with women, particularly through perimenopause and beyond, and really addressing some of the larger scale risks as well, understanding perimenopause as well as menopause and the symptoms associated as well too. And so that's what brings us to this important topic of bone health. And so I really wanted today to give us kind of an overview on bones. Why are they important? Let's talk a little bit about healthy bones, what they look like, what not so healthy bones look like, what risk factors are for bone health, the difference between a risk factor for low bone density versus fracture risk, because they are different. We'll talk certainly about lifestyle interventions, nutrition, exercise. We're just going to talk very, very briefly about testing, diagnosing osteopenia, osteoporosis, what that means. So we've got a lot of good jam-packed stuff ready to go here. I'm just going to periodically be admitting people as we go. Okay, so that having been said, we'll just move on here.
Oh, it's right here around the corner. It's right behind this one.
Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to touch on is let's talk a little bit about why bone health is so important, because really I think sometimes it doesn't get as much press maybe as it should. But to be honest, when we start to look at some of the stats, fractures from osteoporosis are more common than heart attack, stroke, and breast cancer all combined. And those big three tend to get a lot of our attention as we age, but sometimes bone health doesn't necessarily figure into our broader picture of how we're taking care of ourselves. Over 80% of all fractures over the age of 50 are associated with osteoporosis. We're going to talk a bit about fragility fractures, what those are, and what's considered to be a fragility fracture and what that means in terms of overall fracture risk as well. We know that about over 30% of us as women will experience some type of osteoporosis-related fracture in our lifetime. Some of those may be relatively minor, but a bulk of those will be relatively major and require a certain amount of rehabilitation and perhaps limit mobility and independent living as well. The big factor too comes when we talk about hip fractures, and only about 44% of people discharged from hospital with a hip fracture actually return home. So a bulk of people, once they've had a hip fracture, they are more reliant on others. They tend to go into hospital, a rehabilitation center, or sometimes assisted living facilities as well. So bone health is an important factor of independent living. After hip fracture, about 60% will require assistance for at least 1 year after. And so then that responsibility tends to fall on caregivers or family members. And 50% will have a long-term loss of mobility for that. So a movement may not be as free. 50% of those with one osteoporotic fracture will have another. That in fact is one of the biggest risk factors for fracture, is having already had a fracture related to low bone mass or low bone density. Unfortunately, 28% of women with a hip fracture will die within 1 year. And so it is a very common cause of mortality as well, not necessarily from the hip fracture itself, but from some of the concomitant things that can come along with being in hospital and immobile for a large chunk of time. Vertebral fractures are particularly painful as well, so that affects quality of life. And again, about a 10% higher death rate after a vertebral fracture in the year after the fracture. Okay. So, and when we start to talk about bone, it's sometimes we think of them as very static. Our bones are what they are and they don't change, but in fact, they're remodeling every single day, depending on the load that's placed on them. And that's when we start to talk about exercise and movement and activity and the importance of lifting heavy things within our capacity and starting as young in life as we can with maintaining our fitness level, our muscle mass, and our bone mass as well. It's the trabecular bone, which is the network of bone actually within the bone shaft itself that is most prone to osteoporosis or loss of bone mineral density. And when we look at bone as a whole, about 70% is mineral, primarily calcium, and that's why calcium becomes such an important factor all the way through life. And then 30% organic matrix, so collagen, carbon, water as well too. So all of these factors make up bone. So there's a huge hormonal impact on creating bone. Both estrogen and testosterone have roles in laying down bone. They tend to stimulate collagen production, but also bone mineral density as well. There are bone breakdown cells actually that do the opposite. And when we start to look at some of the osteoporosis prescription medications, a lot of them work on osteoclasts, which are medications trying to prevent the bone breakdown. Not as much as building bone up, but preventing bone breakdown. So this give and take of bone building and bone breakdown is very dynamic and it's hormone orchestrated. And that's why, particularly through midlife, women tend to have a higher risk of bone loss and relatively rapid decline in bone mineral density and increased fracture risk with lower estrogen levels. So the most good we can do for our bone is actually when we're the youngest and we're thinking least about our bones. And so generally bone mineral density doubles from the age of 8 to the age of 20. And so think of that when we're thinking of our daughters or our grandchildren or the younger women in our lives as well, that in those years, they are determining what their peak bone mass will become. By the age of 30, certainly, and sometimes even mid-20s, women will reach the best bone mass that they're going to have for the rest of their life. And then from that age, mid-20s to 30 onward, it'll plateau a little bit in the 30s and into the 40s. But once the hormonal shifting starts to happen around midlife, there's a very precipitous drop in bone mineral density, and that can influence fracture risk. So an average loss of about 2% per year, beginning 1 to 3 years before menopause. So the years leading up to the final menstrual period are particularly vulnerable to bone loss then, and that bone loss can continue at that rate for at least 10 years as well. So the estimation is that by the age of 80, women on average, we have lost about 30% of our peak bone mass. So when we look at peak bone mass, again, in women here at the age of 20 to 30 at the oldest, we're reaching our full genetic potential if our lifestyle, our diet, our nutrient levels are keeping up. If there are factors, what we call inadequate lifestyle factors, so young people who are very sedentary, or if there are, again, nutritional deficiencies or eating disorders, or these things that put young women and men as well too into very vulnerable states for their bones, their peak bone density may not reach their full genetic potential. And so instead of reaching a high level of bone mineralization by the age of 30, they're only maybe halfway, 75% there. So you can understand as she ages then, what an impact that will have overall. So a diagnosis of osteoporosis is made based on bone mineral density levels. And when we look at bone mineral density, or our bone density, so to speak, we do that with one thing in mind, and that is to be able to assess fracture risk based on bone mineral density. But they're not synonymous. Not everyone with a lower bone density number has a high fracture risk. The fracture risk can vary depending again on age. It can vary depending on hormonal status. It can depend even propensity to fall. Someone may have relatively low bone mineral density, but they have a lot of muscle strength and good posture, and they have good flexibility and mobility, and so they have less fall risk. So the risk of fracture is a little bit less than someone with low bone mineral density who is not very well conditioned physically. So this is a difference of what bones look like, healthy bone versus osteoporotic bone. And it's pretty dramatic. You can see how fragile osteoporosis and how vulnerable it makes us. So the main risk factors for fracture, the first is age. So as we age, men and women, our risk for fracture increases regardless. And those are, we can't vary that, unfortunately. That is a standard. Low bone mineral density is another risk factor. So again, the lower the bone mineral density, obviously the higher the fracture risk. A history of what's called a prior fragility fracture, particularly before the age of 40 in women. And a fragility fracture is defined as a fracture that occurs as a result of non-traumatic forces. So, and by non-traumatic forces, that's defined as falling from standing height. So if you're walking and you slip on the ice and you fall from standing height and you fracture your wrist, that's a fragility fracture. However, if you fall from a ladder, if you're in a car accident, high trauma force that's higher, point higher than standing, that's not necessarily, that's a traumatic fracture. That's not necessarily a fragility fracture. Okay. So the risk of refracture after you've had a fragility fracture is about 4 to 5 times higher as well. So if you have had, say, a wrist fracture from a non-traumatic injury, your risk of refracturing somewhere is increased by 4 to 8 times. Some diseases also can influence our fracture risk. And so particularly inflammatory illnesses, diseases causing malabsorption like celiac disease, that will impact the absorption of our minerals from the foods and our supplements. Hormone diseases to do with thyroid function, insulin type 1, type 2 diabetes, adrenal diseases as well. Those can all increase fracture risk. And some of the drugs that can contribute to bone loss and fracture risk. And so steroids. So someone who does have an autoimmune condition who has been on steroids can increase risk. Someone with asthma who has chronically been on inhaled steroids increases risk. So as we get talking too about younger people and the fracture risk, are younger people who are using steroids for one reason or another, even more important to start with bone health prevention right away. Anything that blocks estrogen. So when we start looking at women that are being treated with estrogen inhibitors after breast cancer, those can certainly impact bone density, although there are some that don't necessarily affect bone density per se, and in fact used sometimes for bone density. And then we look at our PPIs, proton pump inhibitors. These are often used for people with reflux or for heartburn, and all of those, all the zoles, ZOLDS, those will impair acid secretion. And when we impair acid secretion, we impair absorption of those minerals that require an acid environment for absorption. And that includes our minerals, particularly calcium. A history of falls obviously increases fracture risk. So again, the better balance someone has and the more they exercise and work on balance, the less their fracture risk because the less their fall risk. Body mass index, so height and weight in proportion. We do understand that being overweight certainly has health risks, but one of the health risks associated with being underweight is a higher fracture risk. And that is again because the bones are laid down in the context of the weight that's placed on them. So women that are very petite may have weaker bones just because their bones don't have to work as hard and their muscles don't have to work as hard because they're not bearing as much weight through their frame. So weight and BMI can influence bone mineral density, but does it always increase fracture risk? And that's the difference that no, not necessarily. So just because a woman is petite, she may have lower bone mineral density, but because if she's very active and she's working on balance and posture, and she is weight training, then what happens is she is very mobile, she's more flexible, she's less prone to falls, and her bone architecture may be better as well. And that's what we're seeing on some of the bone density testing that we're doing with people, is that even though their bone mineral density may be in not an ideal category, they may be losing bone mass, the architecture of their bone is quite strong because they are very fit. And so that makes a big difference as well. Okay, so smoking, we know that postmenopausal women who are smokers have a 30% increased risk of fracture, and that's independent of their bone density. So even with good bone density, a smoker will have higher risk. Excessive alcohol, so more than 3 alcohol drinks a day, associated as well too with a pretty high fracture risk, particularly hip fracture, alcohol consumption is associated with. And then the family risk factor, a parent with a hip fracture increases your risk for hip fracture as well. And particularly if your mother has had a hip fracture. So when we talk about bone density testing, we can't feel our bone density. It's not something that's painful if we're losing bone mass. It's not obvious unless we're losing height. If we're losing height, that's a bit of an indicator that there may be some vertebral bone loss. So what we do is we get a bone density test done. And by traditional terms, that's called a DEXA. And a DEXA scan is an X-ray. It takes relatively short amount of time. It uses about the same amount of radiation as 1/10 of a chest X-ray. So it's not a high radiation scan. And if you're at high to moderate risk of fracture, you may be recommended to have a DEXA bone scan done every 1 to 3 years, so that they can track and monitor interventions as well. If you're in the low risk category, you may ask to come back for another bone scan in about 5 to 10 years. So again, just to monitor and keep track. So what the DEXA does is it provides 2 scores on your bone quality. So it produces a score called a Z score, and it produces a T score. And those are different because when you looked at your bone density test, it's just a bunch of numbers and it's a bunch of negatives and a bunch of positives, and it's very confusing. But ultimately, the bottom line with your DEXA is it gives you a fracture risk score, of which your bone density measurement was factored into that. When we talk about a T-score on your bone density test, the T-score compares your bones to the bones of a healthy 30-year-old woman in our case, okay? So if you're 60, your bones are gonna be compared to a healthy 30-year-old. If you're 80, you're going to be compared to a healthy 30-year-old. So a T-score gives us an idea of how strong our bones are compared to in our prime with peak bone mass potentially. So when we start to look at diagnosing osteoporosis, the bone density is checked in 2 primary places. One is called the femoral neck, which is the hip bone, and the other is in the lumbar spine or your vertebral bone density. And both of those are measured because those provide the highest risk of mortality and morbidity if you do get fractures in those areas. So they don't generally look at your bone density in your wrist or your ankles because those ones are not nearly as crucial in terms of recovery. So when we look at the T-score, it starts at 0. If your T-score is at 0, it means that your bone density is bang on right where a healthy 30-year-old is. If it's a +1 or a +2, it tells us that your bone density is higher than a 30-year-old woman says, a healthy 30-year-old woman. Caucasian, I should specify this is based on Caucasian ranges. If it's in the negatives, it tells us it's that much lower bone density than a healthy 30-year-old. By the time it gets to a -2.5, that and beyond that, -3.0, then we get into osteoporosis diagnosis territory. There's a -2.5 or a -2 with a history of a fragility fracture. So all of these things are taken into consideration. The Z-score is the other thing that will show up. And the Z-score is mainly meant to help to measure bone density in women who are not around menopause. So for instance, younger women maybe that have eating disorders and need to have their bone density checked routinely, or women that are in premature menopause for one reason or another. So the Z-score compares your bone density to other women of your age and race. So it's a head-to-head comparison. And so it would compare the healthy bones of a 25-year-old woman to the bone density of the patient, so the 25-year-old woman. And so this one isn't nearly as helpful for women that are around menopause, because if we all compare our own bones to each other, doesn't necessarily mean that's great bone density. It just, so we want to compare our bone density to women in their prime as far as bones go. So right now, the general screening guidelines for your bone density, some of you may have already had some bone density measures done, but you generally need to have one major risk factor to be sent for bone density testing and two what are called minor risk factors. So the biggies with the major risk factors, so age, certainly, history of any kind of compression fracture, any appearance of bone loss on any x-ray that you may have had done for anything else. Again, a fragility fracture, a simple fall creating a wrist fracture after the age of 40, a family history of osteoporosis fracture. Your mom, for instance, has fractured a hip. That is a major risk factor. Anyone that has been on systemic steroids for an autoimmune condition or managing a medical condition, malabsorption, and then someone who self-admittedly falls a lot, for one reason or another, either balance or posture issues. Okay. Minor risk factors, again, we get into some factors here that have to do with lifestyle. So women that maybe smoke or have alcohol regularly, low dietary calcium intake, and then also some particular medications. And here, a minor risk factor is any woman weighing less than 127 pounds is considered, that is unto itself is considered to be a risk factor for bone loss. So again, bone mineral density is one aspect of fracture risk. That bone mineral density you get from your bone density scan is plugged into a risk calculator called the FRAX. And that also is plugged in with your age, your gender, your smoking status, your family history, any medication. So all of these other risk factors, and it comes out with a number. And that is your risk factor for hip fracture over the next 10 years, or other major osteoporotic fracture, pelvic fracture, or spinal fracture over 10 years. And it's based on those risk scores that your doctor will look at and say, okay, you are at the threshold now where your risk for a hip fracture or for a major osteoporotic fracture is high enough that we need to start treating this in some way, shape, or form. So another quick and easy way, although it's not nearly as accurate, is to do your own calculations, what's called the osteoporosis self-assessment test. And this is a research standard. They use this quite a lot in research. And you can calculate your own risk of fracture. A quick little formula. You take your weight in kilos minus your age, divided by 5. So that gives you a bit of an idea of where you are on that scale of osteoporosis. So if you score less than a -3, then you are at high risk. If you're a 1 or above, you're at a relatively low risk. So it just gives you a quick little idea on the fact that weight makes a big difference for risk, but also age. Those are two primary risk factors. Okay. So if your calculated score indicates a 20% probability of fracture, major fracture, or a 3% increase of hip fracture, because hip fracture is often disabling. So even a 3% risk is considered to be high risk. Then in Canada, those are the criteria to be considered for prescription medication for osteoporosis. At that point, the medical standards are that you need to be treated for osteoporosis with those risks. And so, again, any kind of treatment, whether it's pharmaceutical, hormone treatment, calcium, vitamin D, all of these, nothing cures osteoporosis. It's all managing the risks associated, and it's managing the rate of decline of bone density. So now we have hormones. So we understand that with declining estrogen, that our bone mass takes a bit of a hit. So the question is then, well, what if we take estrogen? Does that improve bone density? And the general consensus is that yes, estrogen therapy, menopause hormone therapy, it used to be called hormone replacement therapy. That term is not used any longer because we're not replacing hormone levels to the level of premenopause. We are using hormones therapeutically to address the symptoms of menopause. And when we talk about bone health, estrogen therapy, menopause hormone therapy is a well-established consideration for preventing bone loss. Not for treating osteoporosis, but for preventing bone loss. And so when we talk about menopause hormone therapy and estrogen therapy around the perimenopause, then we need to take that into consideration in our decision tree. You know, if there are other menopausal symptoms, hot flashes, night sweats, then, and there is some evidence or risk associated with low bone density, then estrogen therapy can be a part of the bone health puzzle for some women if they're candidates. So one thing I wanted to touch on today too is we're talking about bone density screening as far as the DEXA goes, which is the gold standard. And you know, the thing with the DEXA is that, again, you have to meet certain criteria to be eligible for a DEXA, which means that a lot of healthy 30-year-old, 40-year-old women don't meet those criteria. So they basically just have to go on faith that what they're doing is helping their bones, and they don't really have any objective measures to be able to monitor that. There is actually new technology that's just become available in Canada, and healthspan at our clinic, we were very fortunate to be able to host two of some of the first bone density screening clinics in Ontario. And it uses a new technology called REMS. And REMS is non-ionizing radiation. It's actually an ultrasound. And it's very specialized technology where they look at the density of the tissues, particularly the femoral neck, again, the hip and the lower back. It's a 10-minute test. It's done in the context of an office visit. It's very quick. It has no radiation exposure. And the research right now is that it correlates quite closely with your traditional DEXA scan. And with this type of in-office screening, we have the potential then to be able to screen a wider variety of women at a relatively younger age when their risks are not maybe as obvious, but preventing as well some fragility fractures that can happen over time. And so while REMS doesn't replace a DEXA, it does provide us an opportunity to have a preliminary measure of bone density in these crucial areas to be able to help women make more decisions, and perhaps as well too, to provide that extra level of motivation that she needs to exercise in certain ways and be consuming enough calcium be checking vitamin D levels and taking vitamin D regularly. For women that are perimenopausal, that are having hot flashes and night sweats, if she knew that she was in the lower category for bone density, then that becomes part of her decision-making tree as well. And so the sooner we know what our bones are doing at a younger age, the more effect that we can have with non-pharmacological treatments. Okay, so this is what the REM scan looks like. So this one particular one, this is the femoral neck. So this is the hip bone. This particular test was actually done on a male, a 51-year-old male, extremely fit, marathon runner. You can see how his T-score was actually very low. He was osteopenic. He was a middle-aged man, extremely healthy by all standards, very active, and he was having bone loss. And so we're finding this as well too with women, very fit and very well-conditioned women too. There are some things we just can't fight against. We can't fight against age. We can't fight against hormonal status. And in some cases, even the best nutrition as well. You know, and exercise, we want to take all of that into consideration. We want to be doing all of that. And at the same time, we want to be able to know that what we're doing is helping. And so the beauty of using the REMS is that we can monitor periodically. So every 6 months or every year, create a bone health program, get a baseline on REMS, get it again to test again too in about 6 months. And then we can see how our lifestyle modifications are influencing the bone health as well, or if a woman is starting on estrogen therapy, to see how that is affecting as well. Okay, so let's talk about lifestyle, because I know we want to learn more about this as well, and what we need to eat and what we need to take and how we need to exercise and all of that. So when we talk about lifestyle factors in general, they are very, very important as bone building. They are very important, exercise in particular, as far as maintaining balance, flexibility, mobility. They are very important in the overall prevention piece of fractures and bone density, loss of bone density. However, once a woman hits osteoporosis, these lifestyle factors are crucial, even more so, they're essential and crucial, but they're not everything. With the diagnosis of osteoporosis, because it can be so disabling, we really need the full toolbox available. And in some women, that may include some pharmaceutical intervention as well too, for established osteoporosis, where the risk of fracture is quite high. And with that, the disabling effect of some of those fractures. So generally, the earlier in life we start taking care of our bones, the better. So we want to spread this to the younger generation as well. Osteoporosis has the reputation of pediatric disease with geriatric consequences. So what we do in our youth can affect our health in older age. So when we talk about exercise and bone health, we have to realize that with bone health, we may be working with a really wide range of abilities and a very wide range too of physical limitations. So the exercise program for a woman who's looking to prevent osteoporosis and to prevent bone loss will be very different than an exercise program for a woman that is quite frail from osteoporosis. And so we need to take kind of all of those things into consideration. Or someone who has had a previous fracture, we have to be particularly careful that way. We know, hands down, unequivocally, exercise builds stronger bones, but it also improves bone architecture. So it doesn't just help with the cortical part of the bone, so the shaft of the bone, but it helps all the spongy bone in there as well too. So where do we start with exercise? Well, it depends on where you're at. So if you live a relatively sedentary lifestyle, walking is a very good first step. At least we're weight bearing. We're carrying our own body weight as we walk. Once you get comfortable with that, move to progressing. So exercise that builds bone is variable, dynamic, and progressive. So once you're comfortable walking, supporting your own body weight, Then you walk with a heavy backpack, or you walk with a weighted vest. You add a little more weight to that walk, okay? Lifting weights, absolutely, certainly a crucial part as well too, as a next step. And progressively lifting heavier as well. And when we start to look at some of the data on bone density, and again, depending on the fitness level and the frailty level of the woman, powerlifting is actually one of your best forms of weightlifting. So, deadlifts and things, those actually can be, the data shows quite positive net benefit. So we're not talking just soup cans, we're talking good heavy weights regularly 3 times a week. But again, it's working up to that. Okay, and the two, physical labor, bending and moving and shifting positions and doing yard work and lifting a wheelbarrow and carrying in firewood and baling hay and all of these things, and carrying babies, as mothers and grandmothers and grandfathers, and all of those heavy loads, those are very helpful for bone density as well. Impact, so running, jumping, skipping. When we add impact, that does strengthen bone as well, but we realize that some people's joints can't handle that. So sometimes that needs to be modified. Exercise or sports that involve lunging. So racket sports, tennis, squash, swimming and biking are good because they create a lot of muscular force, but they're not as good for building bone as exercises that are more weight bearing. Basketball, again, whatever someone is inclined to sports-wise, if it involves lunging and shuffling, those are generally good because they're multi-directional forces on the bone. Plyometrics, so short bursts of power, particularly again involving jumping or mobility, flexibility, good old burpees, box jumps. You've got multi-directional forces and you've got a bit of impact as well. So those are all good exercises. So exercise for fracture prevention and exercise for bone density. So certainly we've talked about exercise for bone density. Now for fracture risk, we have to include exercise is going to help our balance and our posture as well. And that, again, fall prevention. So yoga, Pilates, the Bosu ball is fantastic as well, to be able to help with balance. And again, this is a great time, especially if there is any indication that you're at high risk for bone loss or for fracture, to get suited up with a personal trainer, because at least that way you can have an exercise program that is geared towards you and your abilities or your limitations, so that you're not putting yourself at higher risk for fracture, because that's the worst thing that can happen is you're exercising to build bone density and then you take a fall or you end up hurting yourself. Okay. All right, nutrition. So if there's one thing that I could really stress that probably doesn't get enough press when it comes to bone health is the importance of protein in our diets as we age. And we know that generally with aging, and again, bone fracture risk is a concern with aging. We know that we lose lean muscle mass with aging. And dietary protein can somewhat compensate for some of that loss in muscle mass. And we understand as well too, that good protein levels in the diet also protect bone. And so sometimes I think that, we talk about protein, that we need it, but sometimes we don't necessarily know what that means. So I want to give you some specific examples, okay? So the general RDA level for protein, so that you do not have a protein deficient diet, is 0.8 grams of protein per kilo of body weight, okay? What we're seeing as far as bone health goes is that we need at least 1 gram of protein per kilo of body weight. Okay, and so the amount of protein you need obviously depends on your size. And so when we look at, again, the aging process, and when we're trying to not just build bone, but we're trying to lose body fat and we're trying to maintain and even build muscle, our protein requirements shift up to about 1.6 grams per kilo of body weight. So that's almost double. So for women that are looking to maintain lean muscle mass and even build muscle, healthy bones, we're looking at almost double the RDA of a protein sufficient diet. Okay. So when we start to look at that, I mean, you can calculate, you just figure out what your weight is in kilos, right? And then even times it by 1, right? So if your weight is you know, say 70 kilos, you need 70 grams of protein every day. Okay. As far as spreading the protein out, it's best to spread it out over the day. Some people will tend to have maybe a high protein meal at dinner, maybe a lighter protein at breakfast, and maybe a little or none at lunch. But it's best to take your total protein needs, divide it into 3. So you've got equivalent amounts of protein, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, or 3 meals a day. So when we start to look at sources of protein, so for instance, someone who's 70 kilos, so 70 grams of protein, you can see how, you know, an egg has around 8 grams, a cheese stick, which is about 1 ounce of cheese, just so you can visualize that, is around 6 grams. Cottage cheese, high protein yogurt, around 12 grams per half cup. So you can see how your protein is going to kind of dominate your plate. That is, you can use beans and legumes, you can use hemp hearts, you can use fish, salmon, you can use protein powders if you're doing smoothies. So really, you know, a diverse range of proteins is a good idea, because when you start looking at that level of protein, you're going to be having protein at every meal. And so you know, you don't want to just have chicken be your only protein source. You want to delve into some of the plant-based sources and understand the amount of protein that's in some of the nuts and seeds as well. Okay, so calcium. Then we get into calcium. So calcium, for women under the age of 50, we need 1,000 a day. For over the age of 50, we need 1,200 milligrams a day. And it is one of the most common nutrition deficiencies that I see in clinical practice, particularly in health conscious women. Because what we're doing is we're watching calories, we're watching dairy sometimes we're vegan or primarily plant-based, so we're really not having a lot of dairy. And so calcium deficiency is a big deal, and it's very common, and even particularly in health conscious people. So dairy is the most common source of calcium in the diet, but it's not the only source. And you can have adequate calcium in the diet without dairy, but it takes intention and it takes design to be able to do that. Most plant-based milk alternatives, if you're not a milk drinker, plant-based milk alternatives, usually as long as they're enriched on the label, they will have equivalent amount of calcium as cow's milk, so usually 300 milligrams per cup. And you can add that to smoothies, or you can use that with your cereal or your porridge, or if you choose to, you can drink it by the cup. Those are some of the most calcium dense sources that we get in a day that are not hugely caloric as well. I mean, we could get 300 milligrams of calcium from cheese, but that's going to be a lot of cheese. So. Okay, so we have food sources of calcium. Again, there's plant-based sources of calcium. There's dairy sources of calcium. If you start looking at this chart and thinking, oh gosh, like I'm not eating 1,200 a day or 1,000 a day, then that's where you look at a calcium supplement to fill in the gaps. We don't automatically start women on a calcium supplement unless we know that their daily diet routine is insufficient as far as calcium goes. And there's so many options with calcium supplements these days, as far as chews and pills and powders and liquids and all kinds of ways. A lot of the women that I work with, what we do is we try to help them get as much calcium through the foods. But then by the end of the day, if they realize, okay, I haven't done that, then they'll take a calcium supplement that night. So they self-regulate on when they need it and when they don't. But in the meantime, they know what foods have calcium and what their daily routine generally will provide if they're eating consistently. Okay, so a couple of suggestions on how to build calcium kind of into your diet. So if you do a smoothie, say in the morning, or even really as a lunch, even sometimes, 2 cups of skim milk or enriched plant-based milk, you're looking at 600 milligrams of calcium. You can put that with a protein powder. Again, we need the protein at every meal, so a protein powder. Some ground chia seeds. Chia, particularly good source of calcium as far as the nut seed category go, 180 milligrams per 2 tablespoons. fresh frozen fruit, some almond butter. So in your smoothie alone, like that, with that recipe, you've got over 800 milligrams of your 1,000 or 1,200 a day. So then it becomes more realistic to fill in the remaining gaps through lunch and dinner. A porridge, same thing. So oats with some fruit, hemp hearts, again, pretty decent source of calcium. 150 milligrams for 4 tablespoons. Some chia seeds in the porridge as well, prepared with a milk or milk alternative. So they're around 600 milligrams. Half your calcium just in your bowl of porridge, depending on what you're putting in there. Okay, so now let's talk about vitamin D, because when we think vitamin or plate bones, we always think vitamin D. So the reason vitamin D is important is because it helps us absorb calcium in the gut. So we can have all the calcium in the world, but we don't have the D, we're not going to absorb the calcium adequately. We obtain vitamin D through 3 sources. So food, sunshine, and supplements. So the minimum intake, 600 IUs per day up until the age of 70, and then it goes to 800 beyond the age of 70. Now, those are very conservative levels. So when we start to look at food sources of vitamin D, cow's milk and milk alternatives generally are enriched with vitamin D, and usually about 100 IUs per gram. Okay. Cheese, again, enriched with vitamin D, not naturally occurring in the cheese, but enriched. So again, 60 IUs. Cod liver oil, our grandparents were so smart in giving us cod liver oil, and 450 IUs per 1 teaspoon of cod liver oil. Salmon, anything that comes from the sea will have at least some amount of vitamin D in there as well. Egg, a little bit, mushrooms, a tiny bit. So there's not a lot of dietary sources of vitamin D unless you really do eat a good amount of fish or seafood and drink milk or milk-based products or plant-based alternatives. So in the sun, a compound, a precursor to vitamin D is stored in the skin. On exposure to UVB radiation from the sun, we activate that. That provitamin D goes to the kidneys, and from there it is produced into the active form of vitamin D. So how much sun exposure do we need? They did a Swiss study back in 2019, and I think this is a good comparison because from a latitude point of view, we're not too far away from them. 1,000 IUs of vitamin D was synthesized in 10 to 15 minutes of sun exposure in the summer and the spring, with 22% of skin exposed. So we would think probably arms exposed, legs exposed for at least 15 minutes through the spring and the summer. And that was enough to produce an equivalent of 1,000 IUs of vitamin D. So again, it doesn't necessarily take a lot of sun exposure, but you can't be wearing sunscreen. And people with darker skin will not create the vitamin D at that rate. So people with darker skin may need more sun exposure or more vitamin D through diet or supplements. Okay, so despite food sources and despite the production of vitamin D in the skin, we do know that particularly in these northern latitudes that we do still suffer from vitamin D deficiency. And Osteoporosis Canada recognizes this. And so what they do suggest is that daily supplementation with more than 1,000 IUs may be required, and that daily doses of up to 2,000 IUs of vitamin D every day are safe and does not necessitate monitoring or blood testing. So 2,000 IUs of vitamin D every day in the context of a bone health program doesn't require you to go get your vitamin D tested to make sure you're not running in excess. Okay. If you are diagnosed with osteoporosis, vitamin D testing is very important, and to make sure that you're supplementing to an adequate level. I'll tell you that we do test people that do take vitamin D and that live and play and work outside all summer, and they can still be low after the summer, just because there isn't enough sunny days in Canada to compensate for the lower vitamin D through the rest of the year. The best form of vitamin D is in this vitamin D3, cholecalciferol. That's the most active form of vitamin D. Just to mention too that if you are diagnosed with osteoporosis, vitamin D testing is generally covered through OPA too when your doctor orders it, as opposed to if you're not osteoporotic, generally it is an out-of-pocket expense. All right, magnesium, another important cofactor, one of these other minerals that's built in the 70% mineral matrix in the bone. So magnesium is a component of chlorophyll. So anything that's green has at least some amount of magnesium. Magnesium is very rich in a lot of plant-based foods, apart from the green ones. And our recommended intake is around 320 milligrams a day. And so when we look to see, well, what does that look like? It means every day to get your magnesium, you need 2 cups of spinach, 1 cup of black beans, 1 avocado, cup of brown rice, 2 tablespoons of cashews, banana, and about a cup or 2 of kale. So that would give you adequate magnesium. That would give you 320 milligrams. So that's a lot of food, you know, a lot of good healthy food. So magnesium deficiency, again, is one of those things we often do find run a little bit low. Interesting thing with magnesium is that meats and dairy are actually very poor sources of magnesium. So even though dairy has the calcium and it's enriched with the D, it doesn't have a lot of the important magnesium. When you start to look at some of the plant-based sources of calcium, like the nuts and the seeds and the grains and the beans and the legumes, they don't really have a ton of calcium compared to dairy, but they do come with all the other microminerals, including magnesium. So in a way, they package the calcium up with everything else that we need for bone, whereas dairy is one big hit of calcium and some vitamin D. Okay, so studies show consistently lower magnesiums related to osteoporosis. 30 to 40% of menopausal women are actually magnesium deficient, so we're not getting even the RDA level of magnesium. Okay. When we look at supplementation for magnesium, 250 milligrams to 1800 milligrams a day shows a benefit both in terms of bone density, but also fracture risk. And now magnesium depends on the form, but you take too much of it, it's going to cause loose bowels. So that will tap out the dose that you take. But again, we always start with food first, and we try to get as much as we can through food, and then just top up the balance with supplement. Vitamin K. So vitamin K is required for a component that builds bone called osteocalcin. And you'll see some vitamin D supplements will have vitamin K added to that. The research on vitamin K is promising, but it's not as definitive as the research on vitamin D and calcium with bone health. So you will see some studies that show negative or neutral, not really negative, but more neutral effect of bone density of vitamin K. So again, vitamin K are one of those things that we really want to try to get as much as we can through food specifically. Vitamin K, green leafy vegetables, again, beans and legumes, again, those same ones that contain magnesium and calcium also have K. The Nurses' Health study that studied, again, middle-aged women particularly, and followed them for up to a decade, found that women who did get at least 110 micrograms of vitamin K every day were 30% less likely to break it down than women who weren't. So vitamin K is an important one too. Also in men, as far as reducing fracture risk of hip too. So food sources of vitamin K, again, foliage and green vegetables, same as magnesium. And 1 cup of spinach, 145 micrograms. We need at least 90 a day of vitamin K. Half a cup of broccoli basically meets our requirements for vitamin K. Steamed soybeans, blueberries. So again, just some examples that I pulled just because they tend to be popular foods, and particularly on plant-based diets, and because those are also good, decent sources of magnesium and calcium as well. So you can see how vitamin D, the potential for deficiency is greater because there's not as many food sources. But vitamin K, got a lot, as long as we're eating good amounts of green vegetables every day, at least half a cup of broccoli every day, or other green vegetables, then it's easier to reach our vitamin K threshold than some of the other nutrients, calcium and D. Okay. So again, just to kind of sum things up, you know, we just want to be able to give bone the attention that it deserves. And the ironic thing is that for low bone density to be so potentially life-altering, you know, it's not painful. We don't feel it. We don't know that it's happening. We can only kind of assume it. Maybe once every 3 to 10 years, we get a little window into our bone density by having a DEXA scan done. But it's one of those things almost that we have to nurture and support on faith in some ways that we're doing good things, and realize that we do as much as we can, the best that we can, but some of it there will still be some aspects of bone density and fracture risk that will not be within our control directly. And that's really where we want to have the best of all worlds available to us in preventing our getting major fractures. And sometimes that includes pharmacological treatment as well too. So if you haven't already opened a discussion with your family doctor on bone health, it's never too early to do that. And certainly naturopathically, that is our bread and butter, so to speak, too, is working with people at a relatively young age too, where we can work on prevention, and we can guide towards really strategic, strategic plans with baselines and then with outcomes, and so that we know that what we're doing is improving things. And if it isn't, then we're going to readjust your treatment plan. And we want to make sure we're very results oriented. We want to make sure that what we're doing is actually creating the results that we're looking for. So I just want to let you know that we are doing more of the bone scan, the bone screening testing at healthspan. We're planning to do it seasonally. It's such an important issue, and I really want to be able to nip things in the bud with people as far as bone health goes. So we're doing another one in December, and we're doing another one in the spring. The dates are to be decided. We don't know yet, but to keep in contact with us through the clinic, and we'll be able to let you know that. The scans are $150. They include a detailed report that goes through your Z-score, T-score, your fracture risk. And the interesting thing with REMS is we get what's called a fragility score, which is not just an indication of your bone mineralization, but your bone architecture and how strong those bones potentially are. And you can always follow us on social as well too, Facebook and Instagram. Whenever we have bone clinics or programming happening, we always post it on there first. So. And thank you for attending. And I think we're good for questions if anyone has questions.
I guess the formula of weight minus age divided by 5.
Yes.
What was the next part to that?
That was to figure, yeah, oh yeah, and where your numbers lie as far as your risks for osteoporosis.
Right. So
Yeah.
when you get that number, what does that mean?
Yeah. So if you are a -3, you have a high risk of osteoporosis.
Okay.
A 1 to a -3, moderate, and anything greater than a 1 is a relatively low risk. And again, that's just based on your age and your weight. That's not based on any underlying medical conditions or, again, previous fracture risk or family history. Those are just 2 down and dirty measures that give us a bit of a window.
You said we could get a copy of the print.
Yes. If anyone would like a PDF, email to them of this content that has all of the food sources of calcium and everything there. All you would need is your email address, and I will send that over to you today. Okay.
Fountain at healthspan.com.
Yep. So J Fountain at healthspan.ca.
I feel the ship is sailed for me. I mean, I'm not in that category of preventative. I'm quite far into this other way.
Yeah.
It's kind of discouraging.
Well, you know what? It's not, because you know, right? You know what's going on, and like we said, the lifestyle factors are essential, even with the diagnosis of osteoporosis. They're essential, and we may not be able to influence overall bone density in a huge way, but we can certainly influence fracture risk by, again, improving your fitness, your mobility. Yeah.
I've had 2 falls in the last couple of months, and my mother broke her hip last year. And I mean, it just piles on. I'm not eating well enough, So this has been really timely for me.
Good. Yeah.
So I can work on a whole bunch of things.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's that. Once we know kind of what we can do, then we have the power to do them, right, or not do them. The bulk of bone density, peak bone density, occurs in the 20s and 30s. Okay. From there on in, there is a decline. Now, the rate of that decline is is dependent on all these other factors. If there is a firm diagnosis of osteoporosis though, and we're not talking osteopenia or kind of low bone mass, but full-blown osteoporosis where the risk of fracture is quite high. Some of the bone resorptive medications may again halt that to some extent or slow it at least. But there's really very few to no medical treatments that will reverse osteoporosis.
Do you think they'll ever come?
I would hope so. I would hope so because, yeah, or at least that we can again start maybe earlier and get again that awareness earlier, so we can start in our 20s and 30s and
I've been
40s.
so frightened of the pharmaceutical introduction because I don't like the way there's the osteoblast, whatever, build bone, break bone down. I just don't think it's right to interfere with that process. You know what I mean? Like, why would I stop that? And one thing leads to another thing. So maybe you won't do this, but you might get a shearing fracture that you wouldn't normally get because you interfered with this break. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and there is, I mean, there is a little bit of data that shows that potentially there are some risks like that in terms of atypical fractures
Like I'm interested that you would even say that you do recognize that there might be a need for that. Because my interpretation was anybody outside of the regular medical doctor would be totally adverse. Oh no, you must never take medication for this. Bad, you know?
You know what? I don't have anything better to offer naturopathically, you know.
Yeah.
So, and again, I mean, offering in terms of everything else we've talked about, certainly those are the foundations. But, you know, we're dealing with potential here for disabling falls and fractures. And again, the stats are 40% of women after a hip fracture don't even return home.
Yeah.
I mean, we need all the tools in our toolbox. We have to really look at the data and the evidence and not to say, I mean, you certainly want to ask questions if you're prescribed medication for osteoporosis and see what the potential benefit is and see how it applies in your case. But I don't think we can have a closed mind on any therapeutic intervention when it comes to decreasing fracture risk.
I'm definitely going to make an appointment to come and see you to discuss all this.
Yeah, and we can look at your reports as well, like REMS reports, but yeah, and for anyone that's interested in you know, that have had their own bone scan done or their own bone density test done, you can generally access those results on Pocket Health, and you can actually print out your own report, and then you can bring it in, and I can review and tell you what that means and what options we have available. And you know, absolutely lifestyle, diet, nutrition, protein intake, vitamin D, exercise, fall prevention. I mean, all of that, it's crucial. It becomes even more crucial as we age. However, sometimes we have to look at other options, whether it's hormonal treatments for women that are in perimenopause that are high risk, or again, perhaps pharmaceutical intervention in women where the risk, you know, the benefit outweighs the risks. I'm going to see, I don't know if I can check questions online here. See what I can do. Okay. So is there anyone else that has questions? I'll just unmute.
Did your office move, or do you have a secondary location?
We have our only office. Let me just, sorry, I'm just gonna. Do you know how to unmute here?
I do. Oh, unmute. Yep.
Okay, sorry. I just don't know if there's any questions on the.
Yeah, for
online.
sure.
So yes, our office is on Guelph Street at Mill Street, 22 Guelph Street, the Blue House, across from Sacred Coeur Church, right near downtown Georgetown. And we've been there for about 6 years. We've been in Georgetown for 16 years total. So on Guelph Street for the last 6.
Oh, okay. I thought we were just like ready to grill.
Can
We used to
you?
be there.
Hi,
Years ago.
Janine.
Years ago, we used to be there.
Unmute.
Oh, so it's there now. Because there's
So yeah, there's another clinic there called Elevate. They're also reviews. Yeah.
Hi, Janine.
Hi,
Yay.
how are you doing?
Yeah, good.
Thanks for organizing this today, Barb.
Isn't she
That was
wonderful?
great. I didn't catch the end of the email address to get the PDF.
Oh, yes. Okay. So you can use a J Fountain, as in water fountain, FOUNTAIN,
Mm-hmm.
at healthspan.ca. Or you can just go on our email or on our website and contact us page and send us an email that way. That goes to our front desk and they'll forward
Okay,
that.
great. Thanks very much. And
You're
it's J Fountain.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks. This was really, really interesting. Appreciate it.
Okay, you're very welcome. And do we have any other questions? Do we know? I don't know if there's any other questions. But anyway, thank you,
Dana
everyone.
said she had to leave, and so we will just stop the recording here. Excuse my dog. She's here.